In the summer of 2010, motor yacht Venture 2, a Fleming 65, made the journey from Southampton in southern England to Iceland and back, a journey of some 5,000 miles. But for myself, the real focus of this trip began with our arrival in Scotland. But first we had to cover the nearly 800 miles of rugged coastline between Southampton and the island of Dura. On our first day we had planned a short leg from our starting point at Kilmore Key to Yarmouth on the Isle of Wight. The following morning we set off before dawn past Hurst Castle, built by Henry VIII in 1544. The sun rose over the Isle of Wight and cast its early light over the jagged Needles. This south cardinal buoy marked the approaches to Dartmouth estuary. The estuary has ancient forts on one side and Dartmouth Castle on the other. In times of war, a chain was strung across the estuary every night to protect the twin towns of Kingswear to starboard and Dartmouth to port. At dawn the following morning, the contrails that laced the sky told us that flights were no longer grounded by the volcano in Iceland, our ultimate destination. This ancient cannon, cast in Russia in 1826, pointed the way to the harbour entrance and Dartmouth Castle. This is not a coast where you want to miss the harbour entrance, although over the centuries a large number of ships have done exactly that. Just 8 weeks before our visit, it was announced that a 3,000-year-old wreck from the Bronze Age had been found in these waters. The hazards are not confined to the shore. This lighthouse marks the Eddystone Rocks, 9 miles off the coast. This lighthouse marks the entrance to Falmouth Harbour, the departure and arrival point for many famous voyages, including HMS Beagle on her return from the Galapagos in 1836. After an overnight stop, Andy stows all the lines for the rough passage to the Scilly Isles, which lie 28 miles beyond the western tip of England, past the Lizard. As anticipated, the seas increased, but were normal conditions for local fishing boats. The next hazard was Wolf Rock Lighthouse, another treacherous rock 9 miles off the coast of Cornwall. These old photographs show some of the hazards faced by the lighthousemen when these lighthouses were manned. At last the Scilly Isles hove into view, with Round Island Lighthouse prominent on the horizon. We turned into the anchorage between the islands of Tresco and Bryher and picked up a mooring close by Cromwell's 17th century castle. As we would be leaving in the middle of the following night, we rigged the mooring line so it would be easy to cast off in the dark. The blustery wind subsided as the sun sank towards the horizon. The following morning we took the tender for a short visit to the main town of St. Mary's. Tourism and the export of cut flowers are the main business of these islands. Bluebells and their white cousins overlook a quiet anchorage. I came across this box of sea urchin shells with an honesty box for payment. We left at 4 o'clock in the morning across the Celtic Sea for Kinsale in southern Ireland, passing very close to the wreck site of the Lusitania. Charles Fort, another monster fortress built in the 17th century, guards the entrance to Kinsale harbour. The weather was horrible, with poor visibility and driving rain. Our friends here told us it was the worst day they'd had in months. Fortunately, the weather greatly improved the following day, and we enjoyed the harbour and explored this charming town with its whimsical touches. Here King Neptune is looking a bit green. Our next port of call was Kilmore Key, just up the coast. The green area on the chart shows water depths of 0 feet. So to enter the harbour, you have to drive straight at the shore and then turn sharp left into this narrow entrance, obstructed by battered steel fishing boats loosely moored to the dock. No prizes for guessing who'd come off worst in any close encounters. Kilmore Key is a harbour entirely given over to commercial fishing. Venture looked quite out of place among the rough and ready boats, for which visible evidence of maintenance did not seem to rate high on a list of priorities. When we came to leave the following morning, fog was our challenge for the day, with visibility down to less than 1/4 mile. But at least the entrance was clear. Despite the fog, the wind was strong, making the seas choppy and confused. Our next destination was Howth, not far from Dublin, further north up the Irish coast. We entered the harbour at extreme low tide. The channel markers leaned drunkenly in all directions, making it hard to pick out the channel. We asked a couple of cormorants, but they just shrugged their wings. The following morning the wind was still strong, but at least the tide was high, making navigation less confusing. Unlike the US, Ireland follows the international rule of the road, which is the opposite of red right returning. We were heading for Peel on the Isle of Man, best known around the world for the running of the TT motorcycle race. The wind had whipped up the seas, but the weather was from aft, so our ride was far from uncomfortable. After 6 hours underway, the Isle of Man came into view, and it too had a coastline you'd want to stay away from. The harbour at Peel was once again guarded by a massive fortress built in 1392 on the site of an 11th century Viking fort. The harbour could only be entered at high tide, so we had to wait until 10:30 before we could follow the navigation markers past the floodlit castle. Once inside, the harbour was very secure. At this time of year, in this part of the world, prickly yellow gorse covers the hillsides. Maybe this will be the next venture. A small smokehouse nearby offered local kippers for sale. These are smoked herrings. We drove around the TT course at a more sedate pace than the motorcycles due to blast around these regular roads at 200 miles an hour in a month's time. At low tide, the channel we had negotiated the previous night was almost devoid of water. At high tide it looked so different as to make it hard to believe it was the same place. When we left at high water, the flap gate is automatically lowered and the pedestrian swing bridge opened to allow us to pass. We recrossed the Irish Sea to Strangford Loch, a large body of water, 150 square kilometres in area, which has to fill and empty through a narrow channel at every turn of the tide. The tidal range is about 12 feet, so the tide can run at better than 7.5 knots, while 350 million cubic meters of water rip through this channel, creating eddies and whirlpools. Thunderstorms were threatening as we fought the strong currents. A 1.2 megawatt tidal generator has been installed in the channel. We were greeted by a rainbow and a very helpful harbour master at the marina in Portaferry. Our berth was situated at the end of the main street. The following morning, Chris used the aft control station to leave the dock. Manoeuvring around the marina was tricky with the strong currents. Strangford Loch is studded with many small islands and rocky outcrops called pladies. The chart shows us close to Dead Man's Rock. The bottom contours are very irregular due to drowned drumlins, a legacy of the last ice age, 10,000 years ago. These are the mountains of Mourn, which, in the words of the traditional Irish ballad, sweep down to the sea. This is the town of Strangford across the Narrows from Portaferry. There has been a ferry linking the two towns across this channel, where the tides run at 6 knots, for more than 400 years. There is considerable turbulence where the powerful ebb tide meets the open sea. A rogue wave came out of nowhere to soak me and the camera, which died on the spot, forcing me to switch to a backup for the remainder of the trip. After a quick stop for a crew change in Bangor, close by Belfast, we left the tip of Northern Ireland to call at Ratlan Island, for which this small ferry is also headed. A second, larger ferry sails twice per day across to the mainland of Northern Ireland. This is a male eider duck. We had visited the island in the hope of seeing the bird cliffs, but we were told that the mist would obscure the cliffs. The birds had gone fishing, and the bus driver had failed to show up, and maybe we should check at the pub. But we decided to check the cliffs from the sea, and true enough, there were few birds and poor visibility. We had now reached Scotland and arrived at our first cruising destination, the Isle of Dura. We entered the anchorage off the village of Craighouse, the only settlement of any size on the island. The following morning the clouds lifted to reveal the paps of Dura. Venture lay peacefully at anchor, ready for the start of our cruise through the Western Isles of Scotland, and from there to the Faroes and the circumnavigation of Iceland. The three main amenities in Craighouse are the distillery, the village store, and the hotel from which there is a view of Venture framed by palm trees. The only road on the island is a single-track affair, which winds part way up the east coast and peters out well short of the northern tip. My great-grandfather was born on Dura and spent his early years at the isolated hamlet of Glengarrysdale on the northwest corner. We were now on our way to visit his childhood home. The anchor came up festooned with seaweed, which had to be cut away before we could move north, up the east coast on this stunning day. We passed Barn Hill, the house where, in 1948, George Orwell wrote his defining book, 1984. He nearly lost his life in the Gulf of Corryvreckan, the narrow passage with a notorious reputation that divides the northern tip of Dura from the next island of Scarborough. It was calm when we passed through, but even under these conditions, this treacherous body of water is prone to unpredictable upwellings. At its worst, the bizarre bottom contours produce whirlpools and standing waves as high as 20 feet, which can overwhelm the stoutest vessel. The roar from the resulting maelstrom can be heard 12 miles away. The underwater pinnacle of rock responsible for the turbulence shows up clearly on the depth finder. The cottage in which my great-grandfather lived is now a traveller's hut, known locally as a bothy. I had been hoping we could anchor in Glengarrysdale Bay, but the rocky bottom made this impossible. Chris held the boat offshore while I was able to land from the tender and visit the bothy. 7 years earlier, I had spent 3 days here, absorbing the atmosphere of the place where my great-grandfather had spent his childhood in the early 1800s. It had been a moving experience. Later in life he moved to Edinburgh, where he became a professor at the university and a poet in the Gaelic language. After my visit, we moved back north to a small bay just around the corner from Corryvreckan. The waters were turbulent on the approach, but it was calm within the anchorage itself. That evening we were treated to a magnificent Hebridean sunset. The following morning we set off south down the wild and deserted west coast of Dura. The bothy is the only habitable structure on the whole of this coast, and it looked very small and isolated against the backdrop of the mountains. We were headed for Loch Tarbert, a sea loch which penetrates the island and almost divides it in two. The approaches were quite tricky, with hazards that included rocks marked on the chart, but not on the water. We anchored within the second set of narrows. We appeared to be in a completely landlocked waters, with only the call of wild geese to disturb the silence. We launched the tender, and with Captain Chris at the helm, set out to navigate the innermost recesses of the loch, which had long been an ambition of mine. The way led through a narrow twisting channel, hidden from view until you were directly in line with the entrance. There are rocks in here too, and you must follow a series of leading marks to avoid the hazards. The upper basin is very shallow, except for one pool 60 foot deep. We were now less than 1 mile from the east coast of the island. An interesting feature is the raised beaches, some of which are over 100 feet above present sea level. The beaches date from the last ice age 10,000 years ago, when the land was covered in ice. As this melted, first the sea level and then the land itself rose. It was sobering to reflect that the pebbles beneath my feet were polished to their smooth shapes by waves which had crashed upon these very shores 10,000 years ago. We threaded our way back through the narrow channel and continued around the southern tip of Dura to complete our circumnavigation of the island. paps were within sight all the way, and as they finally dropped astern, I wondered when I would next return. We stopped briefly at Ardfern and Oban before entering the Sound of Mull on our way to Tobermory. Lismore Lighthouse on the northern side of the entrance to the Sound was built by Robert Stevenson in 1833. The southern shore is guarded by Duart Castle, built a tad earlier in 1350. A Dutch square rigger looked very much at home in these surroundings. This Calmac ferry on its regular run between Oban and the Outer Hebrides is called the Clansman, a name which might sound odd in the US but is entirely appropriate here. We turned into the harbour at Tobermory on the Isle of Mull and were lucky to get a berth in the small marina. We liked this delightful town so much that we stayed here for several days. Small cruise ships evidently feel the same. At this time of year they include such ships as the Polar Star, relocating from Antarctica to polar regions in the north. Like Dura and Oban, Tobermory also has its signature distillery. I had long wanted to visit the small island of Iona, but there was no safe place there to moor the boat, so we hired a car and took the 10-minute ferry ride from Galanich across the narrow channel dividing Iona from Mull. Christianity had been brought to the island of Iona in AD 563, when St. Columba landed here with 12 companions. He founded an abbey, which was destroyed multiple times and the monks slaughtered in a series of Viking raids. The final blow came with the Reformation and the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII in 1536, when the abbey was reduced to a roofless ruin. In 1899, the Duke of Argyll donated the abbey to the Church of Scotland on the condition that it be restored for worship. These medieval grave covers were brought inside for protection from the elements. The nearby nunnery remains a picturesque ruin. As we leave the tiny island, it is hard to believe that it had been the scene of so much history and bloodshed. The nearby island of Staffa is famous for its amazing basalt pillars, formed 60 million years ago. Over the eons, these have been carved by the actions of the sea into cathedral-like caves, of which Fingal's Cave is the most famous. We twice called at the island in venture, but the seas were too rough on both occasions to be able to consider a landing. The only way for us to get ashore was to take a tour boat. The jetty area is ringed by rocks, and even on a calm day, subject to considerable surge. Once ashore, we walked over the rocks to the mouth of the cave. Stafford was visited by Felix Mendelssohn in 1829, where the sounds of the ocean waves booming within Fingal's cave inspired him to write his Hebridean overture. One of our fellow visitors was inspired to give voice. The following day, fog shrouded the island, wrapping it in a cloak of mystery. We continued on through the mist to the small isles with memorable names: Muck, Egg, Rum, and Canna. Mist draped the surrounding mountains and lay in layers across the landscape, triggering a dramatic sunset. The following morning, while waiting for the mist to clear, Christine and Patty went for a tour in the tender to look for seals. By noon, with no improvement in visibility, we moved cautiously through the fog and felt our way into the dramatic rock-strewn anchorage in Loch Scavaig on the Isle of Skye. This ladder made it possible to go ashore and hike to brooding Loch Corrist, visited by Sir Walter Scott in 1814 and Lord Tennyson in 1848. Colourful mosses and tiny wildflowers flourished among the boggy vegetation. The following day the mist had lifted off the water, leaving a surface of polished glass. Inevitably, the rain returned, giving rise to an abundance of waterfalls, running like veins of silver through the dark rocks. When we moved out into the Sound, a large fin broke the surface. What can this be? This huge shape lurking just beneath the surface. 30 to 40 feet long and unfazed by our presence. What can it be? It's a basking shark. They feed on zooplankton, and their huge mouths draw in 18 tons of water each hour to filter through their gills. They pay us little attention, and we have to be careful not to run into them. We returned to the Scottish mainland and sought out the white rock that marked the tricky entrance into Loch Tarbert, where we anchored off the small town of Arisaig. In the distance the sun set over the quailins on the Isle of Skye. The following morning we threaded our way back out through the entrance, guided by GPS and poles known as perches. Unlike the US, navigation in the UK and most other countries follows the international standard, which is the opposite to red right returning. The entrance into nearby Loch Moidart also called for careful navigation. Here we were anchored within sight of Tobermory Castle, situated on its own tiny island. This defensive precaution was common practice, and we later sailed Venture close under the ramparts of Island Castle, also situated on its own island, at the junction of Loch Alsh and Loch Duich, deep within the fastness of the surrounding mountains. We now headed for the Isle of Skye and the bridge, which since 1995 has connected it to the mainland. We found a convenient berth in Kyle, just below the Loch Alsh Hotel. Sea pinks, now in full bloom, thrive on rugged coasts despite being doused in salt spray. A common resident is the hooded crow, known locally as a hoodie. One evening we took the train to Plockton, the first stop down the line. This picturesque village on the shores of Loch Carron offers a choice of excellent restaurants. The Isle of Skye is well known for its dramatic scenery, from the Quilins in the south to the Trottenish Peninsula in the north. This rocky outcrop is known as the Old Man of Storr. The cliffs are named Kilt Rocks for their similarity to the traditional Scottish dress. And these bizarre rock formations are the Quirang. It was now time for us to head further offshore, and leaving Skye and the Quilins to starboard, we headed to the Outer Hebrides, which lies some 40 miles west of the inner islands. En route we passed Muck, Egg and Rum, and stopped for the night at Canna. The Outer Hebrides have few airports or even landing strips, but the one at Barra is unique, as the runway is on the beach, and flight schedules are controlled by the time of low tide. We spent one night at Loch Maddie and carefully monitored the weather. We were very much hoping to visit the St Kilda group of islands, 40 miles offshore in the open Atlantic, isolated by distance and weather. We passed through the Sound of Harris, where storm clouds threatened. Once through the Sound, we lost the protection of the islands and faced the open Atlantic Ocean. The next piece of land beyond St Kilda was Newfoundland. Village Bay on the island of Herta is the only reasonably secure anchorage, and then only under certain conditions. It is untenable with winds from the south and east. It is believed that the island has been inhabited for at least 2,000 years. Some say 4,000, and it was only as recently as 1930 that the remaining 30 islanders were evacuated at their own request. Ruins of the old stone houses still mark the line of the single street. The circular structure is the old cemetery. The slopes and fields which surround Village Bay like an amphitheatre are a rich green, which is reflected by the clear water, so it seems almost as if you are viewing the scene through a green filter. From the village side the hills appear to be rounded, but they have no backs to them, and plummet sheer into the sea. Nesting fulmars are tucked into every nook and cranny on the jagged cliffs. They belong to a group of birds called tube noses. The function of the tubes on top of their beaks is to bleed off excess salt from their exclusively seafood diet. Stone storage structures called cleats dot the hillsides. They were used to store harvested birds and eggs, and can be seen all over the island, from remote hilltops to within the village itself. The sheep on the island are a very ancient breed, believed to be descendants from the Neolithic domesticated sheep, and they are left to take care of themselves. Many were shedding their winter coats and looked woefully dishevelled. They could be seen grazing on seemingly inaccessible ledges part way down the cliffs. We took advantage of the amazing weather to visit the other islands and sea stacks in the archipelago. At 1400 feet, the cliffs are the highest in the British Isles. We passed the island of Soay, where the islanders kept sheep, and crossed the 4 miles from there to the precipitous crags of Borrowray and the adjacent sea stacks of Stack Lee and Stack An Armin, which collectively provide the world's largest breeding colony of gannets. The islanders' whole way of life depended on the millions of birds that breed here. Almost nothing in the way of sustenance was taken directly from the sea itself, and the population lived entirely off birds and their eggs, the collection of which involved perilous climbs up and down the precipitous cliffs. The island group represented the entire world for its inhabitants for thousands of years, and it was only when they started to interact with outsiders in the 19th century that their way of life began to unravel. As if to emphasize how lucky we had been with the weather, we had a rough return passage. After a stop in Stornoway, we made our way to the calm conditions of Loch Ewe on the Scottish mainland. What a contrast to the bleak bluster of St Kilda. Concealed behind this sombre greenery lay a feast of dazzling colour, as startling as it was unexpected. These are the Inverewe Gardens, at this time of the year displaying the blazing blossoms of azalea and rhododendron. We continued north to Ullapool. Here we took on fuel for the next stage of our journey to Iceland. Once again, cash was the order of the day. We departed Ullapool and the mountains of the Scottish mainland, and recrossed the Minch to the Isle of Lewis. Stornoway is the major town in the Outer Hebrides and the only one served by an airport, offering flights to Glasgow and Edinburgh, making it a convenient place for a change of crew. The inner harbour was packed tight, but we were granted the privilege of using the cruise ship landing pontoon at the ferry terminal. One good turn deserves another, and here a common tern makes use of the jackstaff on Venture's pulpit. We hired a car and toured the island, which is called Lewis in the north and Harris in the south. This is the Golden Road, so named because of its cost of construction. In common with most of the roads in the Western Isles, it is single track with passing places, and you can expect to share it with sheep. Hairy beasties were everywhere, including Highland cattle. There was much of interest to see, the most impressive being the Callanish stone circle, which dates from almost 3000 BC, making it older than Stonehenge or the pyramids of Egypt. Another curiosity is this arch formed by the jawbone of a blue whale. We had kept pace with the progress of spring as we moved ever further north, and primroses were still unfurling in early June on the bank below this church, which dates from the early 1500s. Another surprise was the extensive white sand beaches, almost deserted, and seas more the colour you might expect to see in the Bahamas, rather than in the Western Isles of Scotland. The land runs out at the butt of Lewis. Here another lighthouse, built this time by David Stevenson, the father of Robert Louis Stevenson, the author, stands sentinel over this storm-tossed headland. This must be the high-rent district for the Fulmers, with their nests surrounded by the spray-resistant sea pinks. Apart from a couple of specks of land, there is nothing between this spot and the Faroe Islands, 240 miles north of here, our next stepping stone on our way to Iceland.